Okay, so first of all, welcome to everyone. This isn't the normal MASTS webinar format, which is generally a presentation and slides and then Q&A afterwards. We thought this was better probably delivered as a conversation between people that operate in different spaces around research and those within policy that may have a desire to engage with researchers. It's particularly important at the moment because there's an awful lot of emphasis on impact and trying to deliver research that is of use to policy. These are often used as very simple and sweeping statements, particularly by our Lords and Masters in the research councils, but without necessarily understanding the complexity of that and the processes and systems that we might need to understand and engage with in order to do that successfully. So the reason that we want to have a quick sort of chat discussion today is really to perhaps explore some of those difficult areas, get, if you like, views from the horse's mouth, people that have actually done it in reality, and get the perspectives of people like Nick and Janelle who have to deal with this on a daily basis. So probably the first place we could start, Nick, is with you, with your hat on, describing, I suppose, what is the difference between, if you like, Parliament and policy and governance and government? And I think that would be a really good starting point for us.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thank you, Hannah, for sorting all this out today and for the invite. So let me just take those two organisations first of all. I notice a majority of people here from Scotland, so Scotland is lucky. It's two governments and two parliaments, so extra policy institutions to play with. Government is an executive body. It does things. It establishes policy, it implements policy, it hires people, it spends money, it does things in the real world. The role of Parliament is distinct from that in that it scrutinises all of those actions of government, and it needs to pass legislation to enable government to act. Now, the bit of the process that we tend to see are the politicians, and because we live in what's termed a parliamentary system, those individuals are shared between the two institutions. So ministers are either MPs or MSPs as well, so you see them in Parliament, and they also have those executive functions. But the officials are different, and often researchers will be engaging with officials, and so you have civil servants who work for the government, and public servants such as clerks and researchers who work for Parliament, and they're quite separate bodies. I'll also mention that's not the end of it. I mean, Mark mentioned that we say, oh, engage with policy as if it's one thing. There are parliaments, there are governments, and then there's local government, and then there are public agencies as well, which fulfil certain specialist functions on behalf of government and are able to act on behalf of government and have different relationships to core government as well. So I guess the thing to take from this is that it is worth finding out before you start a policy engagement journey who it is you actually need to speak to, both in terms of the institution and the individual.
Okay, that's really helpful, and that segues nicely into Janelle, who's obviously a policy practitioner from Marine Scotland, which obviously fits with MASTS remit, the sea, and what we need to do in it. And I think it would probably be quite helpful, Janelle, if you can explain to people the overall structure of Marine Scotland, and I think critically the difference between those people who are policymakers or developers, if you like, and those people that are in areas of policy delivery, because I think that's often a point of confusion.
Sure thing. So Marine Scotland, it's a directorate of the Scottish Government, so one of the many directorates, and in there we have actually 8 divisions. So we cover quite a span of areas, from boats in the water checking compliance up to national marine planning to strategic negotiations and collaboration and cooperation internationally as well. So it's headed up by our director. We've just got a new director, Annabelle Turpey. And then we're split into 8 divisions. So we have the Directorate's office that looks over the business management, the communications, and the marine analytical units sit there that look at all the social and economic research and advice that goes up to to senior leaders and ministers. And we have fishing, the fishing division, which looks at managing fishing vessels within Scottish waters, as well as Scottish fishing vessels elsewhere, wherever they are, and looks at things like fishing and quota. Compliance, so making sure that everyone is actually complying to the regulation and quotas that are set. We have Marine Scotland Science, which provides scientific understanding and ongoing strategic research that informs our policy making and policy implementation. We've got Marine Policy Planning and Crown Estate Scotland all in one division, which is where I sit. So that's looking at planning of the our marine resources and licensing, conservation. We also have the Office of the Chief Scientific Marine. So that's so our Chief Marine Scientific Officer is Colin Moffat at the moment, and that's to shape critical decisions about the future of Scotland's marine and freshwater environments. We've got aquaculture and wild fisheries. And then we've also got the EU exit and future funding. So you can see that it is a huge directorate. I think I have the numbers here. As of September 2009, there were 738 staff. So it's massive. And it's all about, yeah, you have people on the ground in the fishing officers going out checking all the quotas. And so they're on the day-to-day basis looking at implementation of policy, and I myself look more at how do we actually get the sound scientific evidence base to inform marine policies, and then you have the policy makers as well. And so that's Marine Scotland in a nutshell.
Thank you. Again, that structure is helpful, and I suppose from somebody coming from the outside looking to engage with that, would you have a simple word of advice in terms of somebody's got a bright idea? There may not be a funding package attached to it. There may not be some UKRI money out there, but they've got a bright idea that they think might be useful to you. What would be their first point of engagement? What would be their sort of, how would they engage with that system?
So it'd be looking on the website to see, I guess, what directorate or what division within Marine Scotland, so finding out who. A good point of call is just the general Marine Scotland email address, and usually that will filter down to whoever is there at the time doing that particular policy. And there's also engaging with Marine Scotland Science as well. I think that that's a key link between policy and mass engagement or any kind of research.
Okay. Could you add anything to that, Nick, in terms of your experience of people, if you like, with a degree of naivety engaging with the system? What's the obvious point of contact in the first instance?
So again, I think as Janelle has mentioned, I think wherever possible, trying to engage with other scientists or other researchers is a good starting point when you can do it. Within some institutions that doesn't exist. So analytical capacities within local government, for example, have been eroded over the last 10 years. But where you can make those connections through organisations such as Marine Scotland or within core government in Scotland, you're looking at a body called Analytic Services, which provides research services to the whole of Scottish Government. Within the Scottish Parliament, that would be SPICE, the Scottish Parliament Information Centre. And similarly, within other organisations, there are often research or analytical capacities that might be a good starting point, and they can then help you navigate the rest of the organisation. I mean, we talk about these very complex organisations, but obviously an individual researcher doesn't need to know all of that. You just need to find the one point that you're trying to reach. It's not a sort of test on the nature of multi-layered government. You're just trying to find the one person who can talk to you. The other thing I'd add, I guess, particularly in an era of devolution, but also in an area such as marine planning, where there are often lots of different stakeholders, is that it's worth identifying how things work in practice as well as how they work in theory. So often there are, less so in this area, I think, but if you take an area like race relations, for example, that is clearly reserved to Westminster, but in practice, everything in that area is delivered through local authorities, local government is devolved to Holyrood. So in practice, it operates through the Scottish Parliament and government. So it's worth talking to partner organisations, NGOs, other scholars who are engaged with policy already, and just finding out what actually happens on the ground as well as the theory of how it works.
So I think that's an important point, that there is no magic formula and there is no single email to call up to get this advice. I think it's very much about trying to understand the landscape. Just a quick word about what MASTS is for those people on the webinar who may not know. So MASTS is the Marine Alliance for Science and Technology for Scotland. It's a research pool that was established in 2009. It has 17 partner organisations, and what's important about MASTS as a research pool is that those organisations are not just academic research bodies like universities, but it also includes government and government delivery bodies. And that community of people essentially interact around what we call our forums, and we've got 12 forums that are reasonably well aligned in some cases with some of those functions within government. And certainly we have people within government and within regulators who populate MAST forums. So if you are perhaps a member of the MAST community or even not a member of the MAST community and you're looking for some of those contacts, it may well be worth you registering on the MAST website and trying to engage through the forums in order to be able to find out a bit more about the way you can interact in a particular policy area and what the priorities might be. So that's another potential route of information. What I'd like to touch on now is some of the structural problems that have been there for many years and that we are now trying to overcome in various different ways. And I'm sort of looking to Janelle here for some input on the conundrum of timing. Research takes years. We want lots of money to do it. Policy wants stuff yesterday. How do we deal with that?
Not easily, I think is the answer. It's certainly a challenge. So have you, my role, and I guess even within the civil service, you do have these two timelines going on as well, because parliaments may come and go, but in the civil service and the government, we are the long-term custodians of Scotland's and Scottish waters. So we are looking long-term and will operate on yearly timeframes as well. So the type of information that researchers are providing now will go into future marine planning. However, there are elements where you do need a quick turnaround. So an example is we've just done the sectoral marine plan for offshore wind to be published later this year, I believe. And in that, we had to do an opportunities and constraints analysis to look at where sustainable areas for offshore renewable development could be. Now, that had to be done within a couple of months. So trying to find the data needed to do that, up-to-date data, how to then apply that data to these analyses and turn that into policy, that is a very quick turnaround within months. So I think I'll probably talk about this a little bit later in my closing remarks, but I've definitely put things like, even if you're not directly engaging with policy, actually having data shared, having them with appropriate metadata, an explanation on how to use it, that provides all the baseline data and sound science that we will need when it comes to a quick turnaround. I just want to say another thing about funding is that we operate on a one financial year. So we learn our budgets early in the year. Our financial year begins on the 1st of April, and we then have 1 year to spend that money. So that's turning around. So if we want to invest in research, that is a very, very quick turnaround. And I find that a challenge to engage with, to match kind of timelines of research. But if you do think about your research, and if there are any areas that can be a quick, fairly quick turnaround or a bit of an add-on to what you're doing, just to bear in mind the financials timescales that we're working to. And then one more thing to engage is we do have consultations. So every time we put together a piece of policy, There are consultations. It's a couple of months of turnaround, but there's no reason why researchers can't engage in consultations and say, look, you've used this particular method here. We've just developed this method. This is how you use it, and apply it. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that actually answers your question. But
it gets right to the nub of the problem with these constraints on financial years, and also the ability to plan ahead, because obviously with the best will in the world, it's not possible to appoint somebody for a very short period of time with the level of expertise required to deliver the answer. And I think that's perhaps an issue when we get to the end about a pointer to both our Lords and Masters in both sectors to think about. If we are going to do this more effectively in the future, then we have to think about the way that we can put in place mechanisms that get what we want, rather than being hostage to a particular financial constraint or a particular timing around finances. I'm interested to bring Nick in here on particularly the point you made about engaging early and getting involved in the formation of policy. And I think that's an area where an awful lot of people within the scientific community either stand back from it and they see themselves as being the deliverers rather than necessarily the shapers of that policy from the outset. Could you comment on that, Nick?
So maybe I can start off just with a short story. There's I must find out this person's name, but who's a researcher at one of the universities in the south of England, who had led a kind of life of blameless academic anonymity as one of the world's leading researchers on Icelandic volcanoes. And then one erupts and shuts down half of Europe. And this guy was on every TV platform, and consulted by every government in Europe for about 3 days and then vanishes again. And you can take that approach to research. You can sort of wait for the eye of Sauron to fall upon your particular corner of research, and everyone wants a part of you. But I mean, I have to say, it's a really uncomfortable place to be in. I've known a few researchers who found themselves in that position, and it's really actually quite unpleasant. So yes, keeping pace with policy can be difficult. The timescales are very difficult. When policy, when government has an issue it needs to address, it needs it addressed yesterday. But there are also long-term problems that come in and go out of fashion and favour. And I think it's often useful for researchers to try and get ahead of the curve a bit, to look at, often you will be more aware than policymakers of what issues are coming down the path towards a policy agenda, and to, as you say, get in there at the start. Look for times at which you can talk to the policy community. So, for example, in core government, general elections are a really good time to talk to civil servants because they're not being bothered by politicians. So it's a good time to go and say, well, here are the things that are going to be issues over the next 5 years, and to have those kind of conversations. Working with NGOs as well can often be good because they will have that sense of the moving policy agenda of what's coming into focus. If you wait until it's a live issue, and particularly if you wait till it's an issue in the news, if you like, then everyone's adopted a position. It's very different. Useful to get ahead of the curve. But yeah, there's no need to wait for when they're all peer-reviewed and published and here you are, here's the result. Involve other stakeholders, policy, but others as well, actually, in that discussion from the outset of your research. Even just touch base with people, let them know what research is going on. We're doing some work with local government at the moment, connecting them to economists. And the economists are just feeding in saying, this is the work going on about economic recovery. Yeah? So the half a dozen researchers it's the Improvement Service, which is a network of local authorities. But they don't have time to read across that. We've connected them to professional economists who can do that for them. So even just maintaining those kind of, we're here, this is what we're working on at the moment, these are the issues we see coming up, can be really useful.
Okay.
just coming off the back of that, a couple of days, so I've visited a couple of universities. So I went to SAMS and I've been to SMRU, and I just had one day and I had a bit of a kind of speed networking event with the researchers, where key researchers kind of came in, told me what they were doing, where they think the key priorities are. I was able to, you know, question them about their research, what their next steps are, and what they thought. And I found those days to be some of the most useful days to just get a grasp of what the research landscape was and what academics thought were the, you know, the upcoming issues, and just having that in my mind was really useful. So just to kind of echo what Nick said at the end there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good practical example, and I think something we should seriously think about building on. That, you know, that's a really valuable use of time, and I'm glad it did what it needed to for you. And I think that's a very practical and useful suggestion for things like the SMMR program, for example. And I suppose in a way that brings us on to that business of communication. And I suppose just immediately back to you, Janelle, about in terms of communication. Did people talk to you about their science and their research in language that was accessible, understandable, or did they come in and the whole lot just was a blizzard of acronyms? I mean, how did you find it?
Yeah, one thing I've gotten used to in this job is to ask people what acronyms mean all the time. But other than that, it was actually doing that speed dating. I call it speed dating, but doing that fast approach, it was quite good. And I think that many of the people I talked to, it was actually, I found it very useful, and there weren't too many acronyms there, probably because the time was so reduced to kind of 5 minutes, here's the main headlines, which is great because that's what we work with ministers. You know, when we're putting things up to ministers or to senior teams, it is just those key headlines. What does this mean for policy? However, when it comes to doing, getting involved in the development of research projects, in steering group meetings for research, it can be a struggle when policy people are not. Like, I have a scientific background in marine mammals, so I can pretty much keep up with marine mammals. But other than that, I mean, my remit spans ornithology, socioeconomics, fish and fisheries that I'm no expert in. So by concentrating on the methods a lot of the time rather than the actual, you know, outcomes and how is this useful for policy, is a bit tricky. So maybe making communication a bit more about the why rather than, you know, what you did would be advantageous.
Okay. And Nick, again, in terms of, I mean, we've all heard horror stories about, you know, sending the copies of their latest Nature publication and expecting somebody to read it. I mean, what's your experience of, or can you give us an example of good communication between researchers and policymakers?
So, I mean, really picking up on what Janelle was saying, I mean, take pity on your audience. Yeah, so there are within, I don't know about Marine Scotland and similar agencies as well, with analytic services, I think about 250 researchers in total. There are 27,000 academics in Scotland. So that's quite a stressful ratio. If you look at Scottish Parliament, it's a good example. You know, so there's one researcher that I've done quite a lot of work with, Graham. He's one of the heads of SPICE. He leads on academic engagement, which is why I work with him. And the other two topics in his portfolio are climate change and Brexit. So those are the things he's dealing with on a daily basis. And then an academic comes to him who is working on this one very fine-grained, very precise issue, and will know vastly more about that than he could know. But he's got climate change and Brexit and a million other things to juggle. So he needs you to convey to him, here is what you need to know. So I think there's a process that researchers can go through. You start off asking, who is your audience? Then you ask, what do they currently know? And then you ask, what do I need them to know? And then you work out how to bridge those last 2 points. So as both Janelle and Mark have mentioned already, you know, I often come across, you know, people will often say to me, oh, you know, we sent our paper to all MSPs. You know, you think, well, why did you do that? Why did you send MSPs a 9,000 word academic paper that neither they nor anyone in their office is qualified to read or probably all that interested in? But people do it because that's the output. Don't do that. Think in terms of outputs that can be digested. As Janelle says, if a proposal gets all the way through to a minister, it will be 3 bullet points. So you may as well think in terms of what are those 3 bullet points to start with, and what are you trying to convey? What's the top line policy issue? What's the policy question this addresses? And then you explain the research in those contexts.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful advice. And this brings us on then to the tricky question of relationships. And what I mean by that is, over a number of years, obviously, I've been in the privileged position where I've had the capacity to work with policymakers and administrators, and you build naturally over that time a professional relationship, which means you have a basis of trust, and they will pick up the telephone and ask perhaps specific questions that they might not ask publicly, but they trust you to give a reasonably useful answer in a private but professional context. It's a difficult balancing act, but in a way that's the way the system works. But I suppose, have either of you got any specific comments on the way that you can build those relationships in a productive way? And I think, for example, Janelle's example of going into an institution and meeting people face to face and getting a sense of who they are, the work that they're doing, and you will inevitably take a sort of a slight deep breath and say, could I work with that person, or do I think they will deliver what I need? I mean, have you got any comments about how those relationships can be developed in a positive way?
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, so that's one way. And I think I find that relationships with the type of researchers that can see the bigger picture, that do look at the policy and what's coming at the top level of policy, like things like Brexit, climate change, offshore renewables, they see that coming, and they can articulate how what research they're doing can feed into that, can actually answer the policy questions. So, you don't need to go into the depths of the nitty-gritty of how policy works, but knowing what's on the agenda for governments and being able to link your research to that, and then being open to actually engaging the research as early as Nick said, and I think those are the positive relationships that I found to be the most beneficial over the two or so years I've been in this job. But it can get tricky because, especially in the civil service, I'm not sure elsewhere, but I mean, when a researcher moves job or institution, they will tend to take their research with them, and there will always be that expert regardless of where they are. In the civil service, you can move jobs. I mean, people in Marine Scotland could move to Department of Education, someone from economics could move into Marine Scotland, and you're dealing with someone completely different, with a completely different background. And that can be tricky. So my advice is to not just engage with the person, but to engage with the processes and the policies. So regardless of who's in post or how things change, the things like the environmental impact assessment process, the habitat regulations assessment process, they won't change, they'll still be used. So if you have new methodologies or new data that builds on that, then engage with that process, and the person, it matters, but at least you can continue those relationships and that engagement with policy beyond just the person. The evidence gaps we have for offshore, I'm talking about offshore renewables a lot because that's the area that I work in mainly, and it is a big policy drive at the moment. The evidence needs that we need for that's coming out of the Scottish Marine Energy Research Programme, that's not going to change over the next few years if I move posts, if someone else moves posts. So just making sure that you are linking to the policies and the processes as well as the person will help that long-term engagement with government. Okay.
And Nick, what about communications within, I mean, what's your experience of communications within organizations? And we all know, for example, within our own academic institutions, for example, that communications between individuals, let alone departments, can be poor. Is that different, do you think, within government departments, or are they exactly a mirror of that?
difficult though it is to believe it, I think it's worse. In fact, I know it's worse in governments than it is in universities. I mean, you would think there were no organisations in the world that were more disjointed than universities are. But policy functions in, it forms around questions, it forms around problems and attempts to address those. So in the same way that if you randomly get a phone call from someone who wants to complain to you that their child hasn't got their place in the School of History, and you try and explain to them that it's nothing to do with you and there's nothing you could do about it, with the best, however concerned you might be. Similarly, governments are made up of people, and you need to find the right person. There needs to be a reason why they are interested in your particular research, however interested they may be as an individual. As Janelle was just touching on, civil servants change jobs in many ways far too often, and that means that you can keep pushing at them, and it's not that they're not interested, it's not they don't think your research is important, you're just knocking on the wrong door. Now, there is, I think, an upside for researchers in that as well, because often you become the convening point. Yeah, so you're making contacts with different parts or across different parts of the policy landscape, and actually you're the one holding that together as people within the policy world move on and change jobs. But yeah, bear in mind, governments are made up of people. Each of those people has a job to do. They've got pressures on their time too, and recognise that fact when you approach them. But yeah, different parts of policy institutions are appalling at speaking to one another. Truly awful at it.
I'll just echo that and say that sometimes I'll get an email and say, oh, I talked to so and so in fisheries and they said this, and you go, I don't know, out of the 600 employees or whatever it was, you can't assume that we all talk to each other, because we don't have time and there's just too many people. So
can I tell you one other story about this? So the Herald newspaper set up a column that was specifically intended for academics, and the column is still there. It's called Agenda, but the idea was academics would write for the paper about their research, and everyone would find that fascinating, and they would buy the Herald. And so when they launched the column, the editor of the Herald wrote to the vice chancellors of every university in Scotland, saying, we've done this thing, send us your research. And they were amazed when they received this deafening silence, and not a single person replied, which shows an astonishing naivety at the Herald about how universities work. You should write to the press office, or you write to an individual academic and say, you're doing interesting work, tell us about it. But that applies the other way as well, exactly as Janelle was saying. It's, lots and lots of stories about people approaching civil servants and saying, oh, but I spoke to my MSP. It's like, these are different institutions doing different things. So it's really worth scoping things out first and working out who it is you need to talk to, and finding an ally in government. So finding someone within that institution that they can then help you. They'll point you in the right direction.
It's important. And this brings us on to the nutty question of different goals. People working in academic institutions, despite the drive for, in inverted commas, impact, ultimately a bean counter somewhere within a university will say, how much money have you brought in? How many papers have you produced? How many PhD students have you got? And that is the metric by which you will live or die. And I think that's a problem in terms of engaging with policy for the reasons that we've spoken about originally, about answering questions. And that question may not actually require the delivery of a scientific paper. It may actually require best available knowledge being condensed into a report that you get within 2 weeks. And I think I'd be interested in your comments, or possibly even suggestions, about the way that we might begin to address that mismatch in terms of what you need and what we produce or are expected to produce.
I can Go. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. So I tend to sit with a Venn diagram kind of in my head where I have the policy questions, the interesting science questions, and then trying to make them overlap. And again, it's, there are interesting science questions out there that need answered that won't directly feed into policy. And there are questions in policy that scientists just may not be able to address or answer in time, but it's looking for where that overlaps. And so for myself, I'm thinking that I think quite a few people on this call are PhD students that, when we're doing things like the seabird conservation strategy, the Scottish Marine Energy Research Programme, the sectoral marine plan, all these comes out with uncertainties and evidence gaps. And if you're looking at those, you can then see where unique and new research is actually needed. And so you can feed that into master's students, PhDs, or whatever, because even though those are the more longer term questions that can actually, does fit in that overlapped area. So I would say, again, engaging with the policies and what's coming out of. So we're doing the marine assessment at the moment. So the key uncertainties that are coming out of that can then feed into the longer term research that's needed. So that would be my advice of one way to try and merge those two interests together.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. And Nick, in terms of some sort of leading on from that, some practical advice about how you would recommend that, for example, some researchers, particularly early career researchers, those people that want to engage, how would they do that in terms of engaging with Parliament, for example?
So there are a few formal processes already in place. SPICE, which I mentioned earlier, has internships for PhD students and also for other researchers, actually all the way through to professorial placements. As does POST, the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology at Westminster. So there are those formal routes in. Janelle already mentioned the possibilities of consultations. So, I mean, there's a huge range of consultations. SPRE, my organisation, actually produces a roundup of those every week that you or your nearest and dearest knowledge exchange officer can sign up for. So there are those formal routes in, but there's then, I think, a different way of thinking. Yeah? So we go back to that thing with the Icelandic volcanoes and the Eye of Sauron. Rather than waiting for the particular question you're addressing to magically become part of the policy debate, you can think in terms of, well, how does my research speak to policy? And what does it have to say about questions that you know at the moment are live? For example, marine renewables. We know there's pressure to change towards to renewable sources of energy. Pollution, particularly plastics pollution. What does it have to say about biodiversity loss and so on? And if you can think in terms of how can I usefully contribute towards those discussions, and remember that often the top line research finding is quite rarely the bit that's of interest to policy. And when you start thinking about, well, what policy question can I address, often it turns out that stuff that would barely make the footnotes is of real interest to a policymaker. So I say there are those formal routes in place, but also if you try and think in policy terms, then think, as we've discussed, about how you communicate that information. Then there's a real interest. I mean, if you have somebody on this call is sitting on a cure for COVID, don't wait to be asked. There are a lot of researchers in the world, and tracking down the right one is really difficult. And that's why policymakers tend to go to the places they already know. And it's why something like MASTS works so well, because it's a hub and the policy community knows where to go and find that hub. But if you're sitting on research that you know speaks to a policy question, package it up in something nice and eye-catching. There's a one-page infographic. send that off, and that starts the discussion. Then people come back to you and say, tell me more. But yeah, so there are those formal routes in place, but also if you've got something to say, just say it.
Okay.
But I also, so just quickly add to that, is that it's also, how can we help you in developing proposals and getting research? So I know that I've been approached by researchers in the past who perhaps want a letter of recommendation or something, when they're going, I'm thinking early career researchers going for funding. So if you can link that to policy, then do approach us and say, you know, can we get Scottish Government support here for this proposal? If you're a PhD student, have you ever thought about having someone in policy who, or in Marine Scotland Science or an SNH as an advisor or a co-author on a paper? Are you doing a paper that's got management implications? So engaging through Marine Scotland Science or policy on that front could be an opportunity as well to just steer your research towards policy.
There's another aspect of this to pick up that relates directly to PhD students in particular, and to other researchers as well, particularly to PhDs. It turns out, and I hope this doesn't come as a shock to anyone, it turns out there are more doctoral graduates than there are academic jobs in the world. This area, policy broadly defined, is a big recruiter of doctoral graduates. I don't know about Marine Scotland, but I know other parts of the policy world, people who have gone through those placements, those internships, or who have worked as advisors are massively well placed then in the recruitment process, because they have an understanding of the pressures that policy professionals are under. So it's a really useful exercise to undertake, both to make the world a better place, but also potentially to get a job at the end.
Good. I think there's a whole piece we could probably do around that, because many of the MASTS graduate students and probably the super graduate students within our DTP have that opportunity to do placements, and we welcome, you know, offers from government bodies and particularly delivery bodies for placements for students, and those that we have had invariably have gone on and got jobs. So it is a system that is proven to work really well. I just wanted to bring Hannah in now, who's a moment muted, because I think she wanted to plug a Scottish Government Climate Week event.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I just wanted to plug that from the 14th to the 18th of September. Scottish Government is having its Climate Week, and if you're someone from Marine Scotland who's joining our Scottish Government, some of our MASTS researchers are going to be speaking at this Scottish Government Climate Week. It would be a great opportunity just to engage with researchers on various environmental topics during that. So I'm sure you've had emails in your inboxes about this, or if you're a researcher who might have something that could feature in this, just drop me a line, Hannah Ladd-Jones. You can just find me on MASTS, and we can organise that and hopefully get you featured on that very soon as well.
Thanks, Hannah. And if you just stay online for a second, this brings me through to the MAST annual science meeting. And this is actually a really important aspect of what MAST does every year. And it's remarkable for two things, one of which is it's the largest marine science gathering in the UK, or has grown to be that over the last few years. And up to about 50% of the people that attend that meeting are not necessarily directly members of the academic community anymore. We've got people from policy, people from the regulatory community, industry. So it's a pretty mixed bag, and a really good networking opportunity. I just wanted Hannah to just talk a little bit about this year's event, because it's going to be online as a result of COVID. Do you want to just update us on that?
Yeah, so this is MAST's 10-year anniversary. It was meant to be a big ordeal if it was to be physical, but we're moving it online. And if you want to get involved, the abstracts deadline to submit an abstract to speak is the 21st of August, so that is 2 days away. But it is a really simple form that you can just fill in, and that's just to submit your interest as an abstract to speak. Alternatively, you can also do an e-poster, which is a really great way to just talk about your work quite informally and just independently of whatever is happening also at MAST. The deadline for that is the 31st of August. Information on both those abstracts can be found online, just on the MAST website. You'll find the tab that says annual science meeting, and all the information that you need and the forms to fill out are there. We have 9 themes for the speaking sessions, so please check that out. I'm sure there is something where, whatever your discipline is, you can feature in our MASTS annual science meeting with that. It's running from the 5th to the 9th of October. So I know that sounds like a long time for an online conference, but that was because we wanted to lighten the content, but make sure that we could give you the best experience that we can. Registration hasn't opened just yet, but it will be very soon. And we're really excited that actually by being online, we can engage in a community that is outside of Scotland, outside of the UK, and could be anywhere. We have plenary speakers from all around the world featuring live as well. So there is no reason why you can't join. And also with it being online, lots of it is being recorded. So even if you can't join us for a specific session, you will be able to find out what was talked about, those questions that were answered, and, you know, still be involved and do it all from your living room. So that's great. You don't even have to travel anywhere. Also, we have an exhibition hall. So if you're interested in actually showcasing something, or you work for a charity or a particular organization that could actually be an exhibitor or potentially even a sponsor, then please get in touch. All the information that you need is at www.masts.ac.uk.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm conscious that we're now coming towards the end of our allotted time. And I suppose we get to the acid questions now. Probably first from Janelle's perspective, if you had 3 or 4 key pieces of advice to anyone out there thinking about embarking on developing research that is of relevance to policy, what would be your headlines for those people?
My headlines would be to engage with the processes and the policies that are out there already. Do some digging on the Marine Scotland website or the rest of the UK government. I noticed there was a question on UK relevance, that obviously we have Scottish policies, but then there's UK relevance for funding. I would suggest that talking to statutory advisors, so SNH, Natural England, Wales and Northern Ireland, because I know that they do have joined up approaches in some areas to look for that UK-wide relevance for funding. I would highlight data sharing, so making sure that your data is available and in a format that can be used by Marine Scotland would be highly advantageous. And just to encourage you to engage, even if it is just at the Marine Scotland General web address, that will get filtered down to people that can help out.
Okay, that's great. And then really from Nick, could you give us some concluding remarks, Nick, about your long and hard-won experience in this area?
So I've jotted down sort of 3.5 things, I suppose. The first to stress is to recognize your own expertise. It is, I think, really easy for particularly early career researchers, including PhD students, to think, oh, it's the head of my lab who should do that, or it's these particular types of scholars, that this isn't my space. I had the pleasure at the end of late last year to go up to the Environmental Research Institute in Thurso and sit through UHI's PhD conference, or a large part of it, and listen to presentations from PhDs from all different fields. And I just sort of sat at the back of the room, and every single person who gave your PhD in a couple of minutes, I just sat there thinking, there's policy implications to that, and to that, and to that, and to that. It is easy to lose sight of the expertise that you have, and if you are on this call, you had better believe that you're an expert. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The others are, I suppose, immediate and practical things. So think in terms of the policy question that you are trying to answer rather than the research output that you've already got. It is probably a broader drawing together of your expertise that will help address that question. Secondly, make yourself easy to find. Take advantage of social media. Make yourself obvious to other academics as well, but also make yourself easy to find by policymakers. A nice example of that is if you look at my old school social and political science at Edinburgh, if you ask the website for experts on devolution, you will be told that there aren't any, which is a bit of a surprise given that Edinburgh is one of the world's leading centres for research on the topic. But if you type in territorial politics, it will tell you that there's loads of people working on that. So think in terms of how will a non-academic understand what it is I'm working on? How will they find me? Again, who is your audience? And the final thing is to scope out the landscape, find out who does what, who you need to connect with, what are the existing policy debates, and what are the existing political pressures. So you're not going to have an SNP government suddenly decide that the union is a great idea. Similarly, you're not going to have a Conservative government suddenly decide that they should devolve all sorts of extra powers to Scotland. So be aware of that, be aware of the pressures that governments are under with COVID, with Brexit and so on, and work within that. And kind of a related point to that, find allies. Find people who have already walked along this path. Officials such as Janelle know these processes and systems inside out, work with them. Your own public affairs and knowledge exchange and impact staff within institutions and other scholars who engage with policy, again, have walked this road before you. To work with them, and to those perhaps who are already doing this or are more senior in their career, please be generous with your contacts and with your expertise, because this can be, it's easy to forget how daunting this process can be when you start. So yeah, make allies and in both directions.
Thank you. And this is really just a quick reminder for everybody that a lot of the links that Nick has spoken about and Janelle has spoken about will be included as a final slide on this presentation, so you will be able to find out that information online after the event. Hannah, did you want to introduce any of the questions at this stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that we're short for time, and thankfully Janelle already started answering the very first question that we received, which was from Leslie asking, it says, as marine researchers in Scotland, our first point of contact for policy is usually at the devolved level through the Scottish Government and Marine Scotland. But funders and reviewers often want to see UK-wide benefits. What advice can you give to researchers who want to balance policy impacts at the Scotland level and within the UK level, which confines of a single project? So Janelle, you already mentioned that actually speaking across those kind of cross-border organisations such as SNH, Natural England. I wasn't sure if there was anything else you wanted to build on now that we're focusing in on this question a bit more, or Nick and Mark, if you have any other comments.
Sure. Yeah, I think that if you're engaging with Marine Scotland science or Scottish policy, that we do have an awareness of, for example, offshore renewables again. Offshore wind has cumulative impacts across the whole of the North Sea, never mind just Scotland and the rest of the UK. And so we already have contacts within the rest of the UK. We've been involved in national marine planning across the EU. So if you find that the right person within Marine Scotland or within Marine Scotland science, again, it's knowing the landscape, knowing who to talk to, and then engage with them to see how their policy and where they interact as well with other devolved governments and EU contacts as well. So in Scotland, we don't just work in silo in Scotland.
Very similar, really. I mean, it's again, it's about being generous with your knowledge. That yes, funding councils in particular seem to be constantly surprised that devolution exists. But actually, if you've secured impact, you've secured impact, and you can present that regardless of the language that's used. It's also worth stressing that, you know, not only does devolution exist, but there is local government as well. There are all sorts of other agencies. So these questions are often couched in UK terms, which is frequently a shorthand for English terms because the particular policy area is devolved. But, you know, it's only been 20 years, so I'm sure funding councils will catch up at some point.
I won't say anything there on the grounds that I might. I might use it. Anyway.
Right, thank you very much. We have one more question submitted, and that is from Simon, saying that they have heard of people in Marine Scotland and the MMO saying we can only act within the existing policy and legislation, not change it. That's a fair response, but does that mean that they've been talking to the wrong people? Should Simon be talking to different people in Marine Scotland, or should he actually be trying to get politicians' attention? What is the advice for that, do you think?
Mine is it depends on the policy and the science and who he's talking to. So my answer is, well, it depends.
I think
that's it.
I think we probably need a bit more information on that one. But Simon, if you wanted to contact us afterwards,
yeah,
offline, we can certainly provide you, hopefully, with some more direction. But we probably need a bit more information to be able to provide a solid answer for you. If there are no more questions at this stage, I realise we've actually just run slightly over time. So thank you very much to Nick and to Janelle. Thank you to the audience for listening. Hopefully this format's been useful and reasonably engaging. Please just give us your feedback, because it will prevent us making the same mistake again. If we've made a mistake, we'll hopefully encourage us to do it again if it's been a good way of delivering information. I'll hand you over to Hannah to finish off. But thank you.
Can I just, say one thing? My email there, it's janelle.braithwaite@gov.scot, not scot.gov, just in case anyone wants to get in contact. Thanks.
Scot.gov is quite a cool email address to have.
Oh, look at that. Excellent, thanks.
We are living in the future.
Absolutely. Right. Thank you all so much, Mark, Nick and Janelle. Thank you for featuring in today's MASTS webinar. It was really helpful, well, for me, and I really hope it was helpful to everyone else who tuned in, and to anyone who's still with us. This whole session was recorded, so if you want to listen back to a particular point in our conversation, please check out the MASTS YouTube page at the end of today, where you'll be able to find this recording. You'll be able to share it wherever you want as well. And the contact details for today's speakers are on your screens as well. So please feel free to contact MASTS if you have any other questions or feedback as well. That would be interesting. Direct that at Mark. And that's everything from today. So thank you.
Okay, thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
I would just like to highlight, if you're still with us, that we have one webinar left, and this is with Dr. Carlos Lurio. I think I've pronounced that right. I probably haven't. Please sign up for this last talk, and please let us know if you've enjoyed them. If you would like to feature in another webinar series next year, please let us know. We'd love to just note you down and be able to contact you later on in the year. And that's the end of our MASTS webinar series next week. So please check it out if this is something that interests you. The MASTS Annual Science Meeting, we've already spoken about it, but it is running from the 5th to the 9th of October. And those two deadlines are on your screen right now. And just check out the MASTS website for all the information that you need to either submit an speaker abstract, a e-poster abstract, or if you want to be an exhibitor. All the information that you need is there. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you next week.